Thank you for that, Simon. I'm told when I give a speech, I often give a very long introduction full of digressions, a very short speech. So I try and cram in everything that I wanted to say in the last 5 minutes. So I shall try and avoid doing that and try and stick to the subject in hand. It'd be very easy to spend, say, 20 minutes, because I want to talk about 20 minutes and then I open it up to questions. It'd be quite easy to fill that time and not even get to the subject and just be talking about the general political situation in the 1640s in England. Before I get into it, I thought I might just answer a question that was posed to me downstairs in the toilet. What's the point of this? What's the point of this discussion? Why should any libertarian in the 21st century care that much about what was going on in England in the 17th century? The way I would answer that and say would be to say libertarianism has grown quite considerably in the last couple of decades, probably for one reason above all others, which is the internet. Firstly, as a means of communication, probably almost everyone in this room would have found out about this meeting via the internet. And secondly, as a source of information and education. And you could probably, in 10 minutes, you could download a library of some of the great classics of the libertarian tradition that you couldn't have got in 10 years of wandering up and down Charing Cross Road, if you even knew what you were looking for. Now, I maintain I've been a libertarian since at least sort of nursery school, but it wasn't until the last 10 years or so that I've called myself a libertarian. And I think a lot of libertarians of my age and older have had a similar experience. If you get some way into adulthood without actually encountering libertarianism as a political philosophy. So it was rather like coming across a description of a rare medical condition and realising that's what you've been suffering from all along. So this is not something that really should affect younger people because, for the reason given with the internet. But the risk is that libertarianism will seem like it's just some new fad, something we've imported from America. And one of the attacks I've seen on libertarianism a few times is the one that goes, I used to be a libertarian, but now I've grown up. And what you get there is a straw man version of libertarianism, which crumbles into dust at the first complexity, as if nobody's ever bothered to think things through. But of course they have. I mean, the difficulties of a free society or a society based on individual liberty, of course people have thought these things through. Now, we're talking about the 17th century, so I might as well get a biblical reference in. There's a parable in the Bible. Jesus talks about the farmer sowing seed. And some of the seed falls amongst the weeds, and the plants grow up, but the weeds choke the plants. And other seed falls into the shallow soil, and the plants grow up, but the sun beats down, and they wither and die because they don't have the roots. And so the purpose of this speech, if there is one, is to say we do have roots. The struggle for liberty goes deep into the political culture of this country. When we're talking about 17th century England, anything we might want to say about it is equally applicable, if not more so, to America, which at this point was just a few settlements on the eastern seaboard, and the rest of the Anglosphere as well. So that's kind of the purpose of it, to say that this is our culture. This goes deep into our culture. So, with that said, I'll move on to the question of the levellers. And now the speech is called The Levellers, Falsely So Called. And the first question is, what is a leveller? Now, the original meaning of this word was someone who levels fences, specifically fences that have been put round land to enclose it for private use. And so the idea of a leveller in its original sense was kind of like a revolting peasant. And now this wasn't necessarily land that was common prior to enclosure. It was more likely, I think, the case that it was land that was owned by the landowner, but the common people had certain rights of access and certain rights of usage, such as gathering firewood or grazing their animals. And so when the land was enclosed, it wasn't an attack on the actual ownership of the land, but it was a negation of the rights, the customary rights that people had. Now, in the Civil War going on in England, a lot of this was going on because people took the opportunity to break down fences and to get back what they considered their own. But by the time it's being used for the people that I'm going to be talking about, the meaning of it is slightly different. And the meaning is more to do with levelling men's estates. And so the idea which is being put about is that the so-called levellers want to bring in some kind of egalitarianism or some kind of communism, and therefore the political ideas they're putting forward would lead to an attack on the principles of property. So the people we're talking about do not wish to be called levelers, and they see the use of the word merely to sort of blacken their name in the public's eye, and to misrepresent what they actually wish to achieve. So when we're talking about the level of movement, we're really talking about a movement that grows up around one man above all others, and that man is John Lilburne, and the various trials and tribulations of his life as he struggles against the authorities. And alongside John Lilburne, there are two other names which will always be mentioned, which is William Walwyn and Richard Overton. And so these three writers produced a huge amount of work, and it's interesting to contrast their different styles, and interesting to see that they don't all agree on everything, but they do work together very much as a team. But it would be a mistake, certainly in the case of John Lilburne, to think of him as primarily a writer. He did write a huge amount, but most of this was written when he was in prison. Had he not spent most of his adult life locked up, maybe he wouldn't have written so much. And he's certainly a political leader more than a writer. Now, of the three writers, or looking at their work, Lilburne is probably the least accessible, I would say, of the three, the least accessible to a modern reader. And in terms of style, he tends to try and batter you into submission and goes on for page after page, giving example after example. Whereas William Walwyn is much more a voice of reason. He's someone that he believes that people of goodwill can be brought round if only you rationalise with them and you discuss them, and he engages in Socratic debates with the people. This tends to get him into trouble, because when he's accused of holding certain beliefs, such as if he's accused of being an atheist, he'll come back with, well, why do you believe in God? And he'll challenge people to actually come up with reasons to support their positions. And when they can't come up with reasons, then they just denounce him. And the other writer is Richard Overton, who's much more of he's much more satirical. And he has a similarly combative style as John Lilburne, but he's a lot more short-winded. He sort of gets in his punches pretty quick. So those are the three writers, the most important writers, or people that actually wrote, whether or not you consider them first and foremost to be writers. And another name that is important, who's someone who was a military leader, is someone called Thomas Rheinsberg, who I'll come to later. So, of course, when you're looking back on the level of movement, then you're going to look at the work that is presented through the various pamphlets and petitions that were produced. But then there were all these other figures who didn't necessarily leave that kind of record, but they did have an influence at the time. So who was John Lilburne? The question, you can't really talk about this without talking about John Lilburne as a person. Now, he first comes to prominence back in 1637, when he's arrested with a lot of illegal books. And he's dragged in front of something called the Court of Star Chamber, which was not an ordinary court of law, but was rather an instrument of the Privy Council. And the usual rules of law didn't apply. So he's required to take an oath, and he's required to answer whatever questions were put to him. So he refuses to take the oath, and he refuses to answer any questions on the grounds that these may incriminate himself, and this is against what he considers to be his rights under common law. Now this doesn't go down particularly well, and they sentence him to a large fine, and they also sentence him to be tied to the back of a cart and whipped from the Fleet Prison, which is up near St Paul's, Ludgate Circus Way, all the way to Whitehall, and then put in a pillory. So with every beat of the whip, he sort of calls out to Jehovah and asking for strength and courage. And when he's put in the pillory, he sermonizes to the gathered crowds, denouncing the bishops and challenging the bishops, which is what the book that he was arrested for, that was an attack on the bishops. So he denounces the bishops and he challenges them to debate him. And the order comes to shut him up. He won't be shut up, so they bind his mouth. And even when they bind his mouth, he stamps his feet and makes all sorts of ruckus to refuse to be silenced. And somehow, I don't know how he did it, because he was in the pillory, he managed to just throw some of these illegal books into the audience. So all this kind of stuff goes down very well with the people of London in the 1630s. They like a good bit of theatre, and Lilburne was always good value. So he gets from this point a reputation for standing up against tyranny and standing up for the common man against whatever forces that are arraigned against him. Now, going back, the period that I want to be talking about, that's John Lilburn in his first sort of public appearance. And right at this very early time, you can see some of the key elements of what becomes the level of programme in the accusations against him. First, and what he stands up for. Firstly, freedom of religion. This is the key issue for the radicals and the levellers in the 1640s. Is freedom of religion. And the book that he's arrested in possession of is an attack on the established church, an attack on the bishops. Second issue is freedom of the press, because the book has been banned. Lilburn went to Holland and printed it in Holland and brought it back into the country. So it's an illegal book. And thirdly, which is connected, and all these issues of liberty are kind of connected, is the idea of freedom of trade. Because not only do the books in this time have to pass a very rigorous censorship, there was also in place a monopoly on printing with the stationers' company. So you have to go and pay the stationers their due. So the issue of monopolies in trade is one of the key bones of contention, one of the key things that is being attacked by the levellers in the later political struggle. And the other issue, besides those, which is key to understanding what John Lilburn was trying to achieve, is the question of the law and the question of his rights under the law. What are his rights as he calls himself a freeborn Englishman? And so, from his point of view, if he's done anything wrong, he should be accused under the known law. He should be brought into an ordinary court of law and tried in front of a jury of his peers. And he should not be forced to give evidence against himself. And so this question of law is very much central to what John Lilburn is trying to achieve in the whole time that he's involved in this struggle. But it's also worth sort of noting the position of law as part of politics. Because when we talk about politics these days, it's talking about running schools or hospitals or this and that policy. But back in this time, it's really a question of just really about what the law is, and what exactly, not even what the law should be, but what it actually is. And this really is part of the struggle between the King and the Parliament in what is the Civil War. Now, that said, and I know I'm speaking quite fast, but I should talk a little bit about the English Revolution and the general historical context that John Lilburn and the Levellers emerge. Now, I mean, I hope you've all done your homework on this subject, by the way. But maybe you know this, maybe you don't. I mean, if I mention the English Revolution, some people might be thinking, well, we've heard of the French Revolution, we've heard of the American Revolution. What about the English Revolution? What is this? What I'm not talking about is the Glorious Revolution, which happens some 50 years later. But in 1649, the King of England, Charles I, is put on trial for treason, found guilty, and executed. Following this, the monarchy is abolished, the House of Lords is abolished, and a unicameral parliament is set up with the remnants of the House of Commons, and a Council of State is formed to be the government of the nation. So England in 1649 ceases to be a monarchy and it becomes a republic of sorts. Now this republic lasts for about 4 years, until 1653, I believe. Oliver Cromwell, one of the chief instigators of the revolution, dissolves the parliament, and from that time until his death he becomes a sort of Caesarian military dictator. Now in 1658 when he dies, the problem with dictatorships is invariably the succession. And so when he dies, there's an attempt to put his son Richard Cromwell into the position of Lord Protector. That's the title that Cromwell takes for himself, Lord Protector. But that doesn't work because his son doesn't have anything like the influence or the power that his father has. So he abdicates, at which point the parliament which Cromwell dissolved in 1653 crawls out of the woodwork and tries to reanimate the republic. But then there's another military coup under General George Monk, who invites the son of the executed king back from exile, and in 1660 you have the restoration of the monarchy. So from 1649 to 1660 you have what is called the interregnum, which is between the rule of Charles I and the restoration of his son. Now what has led to the execution of Charles I is a struggle for supremacy between the king and the parliament, which breaks out into a civil war in 1642. By 1645 the king is effectively defeated, And in 1646 he surrenders to the Scots, who at that time are allies of Parliament. And early in 1647 the Parliament of England pays a lot of money to the Scots. They take the money, pay off their troops and all go home and hand over the king. So in 1647, early 1647, the king is a prisoner of Parliament. The question is then, how do we settle the peace? And it's in this period from 1647 to 1649 that the level of movement really comes into prominence. So, you're all keeping up with that, isn't it? So we have John Lilburn, Richard Overton, William Walwyn. They're the main leaders of it. As I say, some of the key issues that have come up early on is this question of freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of trade. And the question of what the law is. Now, the debate, the fight between the king and the Parliament really centres on what is the law. And from 1629 to 1640, the king has ruled without any Parliament whatsoever. He doesn't want to call a Parliament. Now, without a Parliament, he doesn't have any means of raising taxes. So he tries every trick in the book to raise money without having to call a Parliament. This gets him into certain troubles over something called ship money. I mean, he's doing things like he's using fines. He's forcing people to buy peerages or buy sort of aristocratic titles. And then there's a tax called ship money, which is levelled on all the ports. And what he decides to do is he's going to make everybody pay this one tax. So the question then comes up, is this a new tax or is it not? Because everyone that hasn't been paying this tax says, well, it's a new tax. But he says, well, no, it's an old tax. It's been around for a long time. So this goes into court, and the courts, unsurprisingly, rule in favour of the king. They basically, and the ruling comes down. Basically, the king can do what he wants. He's the king, and that's the way it is. But in 1640, the king's hand is forced, and he needs to call a parliament because there's trouble in Scotland and there's trouble in Ireland coming. And so when the parliament is called, it's in no mood to acquiesce and to sort of rubber stamp what the king is planning to do. And it raises all the issues and all the grievances that it's had from all the period when the king has been ruling simply by himself. And the question, what the parliamentarians are saying is that the king has basically broke the law, that he has exceeded his authority. And what the king's argument is that he is the king, therefore he is the embodiment of the law, and he can do what he wants. And so the question is, what is the royal prerogative? What does this consist of? Is it a case that the law is here, and the royal prerogative sort of floats above it as if it's on a cloud? Or does the law create the royal prerogative? And so the parliamentarian argument is saying that the king has exceeded his authority and he's broken the law. And he's broken what they call the fundamental laws of the land. Now what the king responds to this is, well, what laws are these? Show me what the laws are. And Parliament doesn't really have, in terms of the dispute with the king, they don't really have the precedents that they can call upon. So they have to retreat, because they're asking for things that the Parliament never really has had in the past. So they have to retreat away from precedent and make arguments on the basis of reason. And so they're making arguments such as salus populi suprema lex, the safety of the people is the supreme law. And they're also making arguments on the basis that the Commons is the embodiment of the people, and therefore the law of reason says that the people cannot acquiesce in their own destruction. And certain arguments that they're putting forward, which aren't particularly convincing necessarily, and as the Cavaliers point out, lead to certain notions such as sovereignty of the people and democracy. Now, this is not at all in the mind of the parliamentarian leaders, that they want to take it in that way. And they don't see themselves at that time as the representatives of the people, but rather they see themselves as the embodiment of the people. And it's always worth sort of asking, when people start talking about the liberty of the people, who do they mean? Well, in the case of the Parliament, they mean themselves, and they don't mean the peasants, and they don't mean the commoners. So the problem is, though, that they've opened up Pandora's box. Not only do the Cavaliers point out that their arguments in terms of the sovereignty in Parliament lead towards the ideas of the sovereignty of the people, but this is taken up by some of the more radical elements within their own side. So what this leads on to, I guess, is from the point of the sovereignty of the people, we kind of get the idea put forward that is later very close to what John Locke was saying, which is about the question of individual sovereignty. And one of the most quoted leveller tracts is one by Richard Overton, which is called An Arrow Against All Tyrants. And the full title being An Arrow Against All Tyrants and Tyranny, shot from the prison of Newgate into the prerogative bowels of the arbitrary House of Lords and all other usurpers or tyrants whatsoever. Something like that. And
snappy.
Snappy, yeah. And what you find in this pamphlet, in the start of this pamphlet, is probably the clearest explanation of what the leveller idea of individual liberty was. And so I'm going to read a little bit of this. So this is from An Arrow Against All Tyrants. It says, "To every individual in nature is given an individual property by nature, not to be invaded or usurped by any. For everyone as he is himself, so he has a self-propriety, else he could not be himself. And of this no second may presume to deprive any of, without manifest violation and affront to the very principles of nature, and of the rules of equity and justice between man and man. Mine and thine cannot be, except this be. No man has power over my rights and liberties, and I over no man's." Now, he goes on with regard to the relationship between the people and the government. And what he says here is, "It is nature's instinct to preserve itself from all things hurtful and obnoxious, and this in nature is granted of all to be most reasonable, equal, and just. And from this fountain or root, all just human powers take their original, not immediately from God, as kings usually plead their prerogative, but immediately by the hand of nature, as from the represented to the represented." Now, what he's saying here is that the relationship between God and man is such that God is here and man is here. And the question is, where does the king sit? The king claims that the king sits here and getting his power directly from God, and then he rules over us. What Overton is saying is that's not the case. The God's here, he passes his power to man, and then man delegates the power down to the king or to the government. And he also goes on further to say, "No more may be communicated than stands for the better being, weal, or safety thereof. And this is man's prerogative and no further. So much and no more may be given or received thereof. Even so much is conducent to a better being, more safety and freedom, and no more. He that gives more sins against his own flesh, and he that takes more is thief and robber to his kind." So here he's saying not only does the power that the government have derive from the individual self-preservation of the people, but only those powers that are conducive to the benefit of the people can be passed on. They cannot pass on certain rights and properties because these are inalienable. He doesn't use the word inalienable, but that's what he's saying. And so he further goes on to compare the relationship between the people and the government as the relationship between the parents of a child and a tutor that the parents appoint to teach that child. So that means that only those powers which to do with the tutor educating the child can be passed on. And if they don't do a good job, they can be fired and somebody else can be put in their place. And much as I'm quite happy to read this out in public, and much as I can go home and say that I agree that and sleep well in my bed tonight, this is a man writing from prison, and he's attacking the very foundations of the government that is in place at this time. And he's specifically attacking the House of Lords. So from this idea of individual liberty, all the other sort of ideas of the levellers, they can be derived. So if man has this individual property, then this applies in terms of religion, because you can't give over the power to destroy yourself, because you'd be going against nature. And the same applies in terms of trade and all the rest of it. So within that idea of individual liberty, that's where you find the rest of the sort of the leveller sort of ideas in terms of of politics. Now, getting back to the sort of political situation, as I said, in 1647, the king is a prisoner of Parliament, and so the issue then is how to settle the peace. And Parliament has sort of two main problems. One problem is getting the king to agree to anything, and if he does agree to it, what's to keep him from reneging on the deal once he gets himself back into power? And if anybody knows anything about the king, there's nothing to stop him doing that. And the other problem is that the army that has been created in order to prosecute the war, they want to get rid of it. And at this time, when the king is the prisoner, the parliamentary side begins to fracture into two main factions. The one faction which is dominant in the parliament, and another faction which is dominant in the army. And the parliamentary faction, what they wish to do is they wish to keep everything pretty much as it was before the war. But they just want to change the government of the government of the church. They want to change it from what it has been under Charles, and introduce a much more reformed Protestant church. But they want to keep every sort of power of coercion in place, and they certainly don't want to upset the social balance of the nation in terms of where the power lies and the position of the ordinary people. They're not egalitarian in any way. And the problem is that most of the army, according to the leaders of the parliamentary faction, could be denounced as blasphemers and heretics and all the rest of it. And so the army's in no they're in no mood to be treated so shabbily as the Parliament wishes to deal with them at that point. And the Parliament wants to get rid of the army, either to pay them off and let them go home, or send them off to Ireland to conquer Ireland, which has been in revolt from England for about 6 years at this point. Now, there are certain grievances that the army has. The first grievance is that they haven't been properly paid, and in terms of the cavalry, they haven't been paid for the best part of a year. And all along, they're still having to pay their own expenses, and in terms of the cavalry, they also have to pay for their own horses. So they want to get paid the money that they're owed. The second issue is that they've done lots of things in the service of the Parliament that, if they hadn't been serving Parliament, would be considered to be crimes. And there are stories flying around how soldiers are leaving the army, and then they're getting dragged into courts for stealing horses and things like that, which they've done in the service of the Parliament, and even getting hanged. Now, whether anybody was getting hanged for that is hard to say, but those are the stories going around. So the soldiers want to be paid, and they want an act of indemnity to indemnify them from any acts that they did in the service of the Parliament. Now, Parliament at this point treats them with a sort of a suicidal contempt and denounces the army as being traitors. So what happens then in the army is there's this almost spontaneous political awakening, and the different regiments of the army elect representatives, and they form a sort of a council of the army, a democratic council, and they pledge that they call a general rendezvous, and they pledge that they will stick together until what they were told they were fighting for, which was the restitution of the liberties of the English people, until that has been achieved. And so the army then enters into the sort of the political battle, and they do something that is very significant. Is they go and find where the king is being held by the parliamentary commissioners. They then take him, and they hold him prisoner themselves. So this time within the army, you have this sort of democratic movement. 5 minutes. You have a democratic movement, and they push for a settlement of the nation, of the peace of the nation, which is a document called the Agreement of the People. And this is, if you want to know what the Levellers intended to put in place as a settlement, the best place to get it down in one place is in the various versions of this document, the Agreement of the People, which was an attempt to put sort of a written constitution into place. Now, when you read that document, you'll find there's two main elements to it. One is parliamentary reform, the idea that every man over the age of 21, with certain exclusions for beggars and for servants, should have the vote. that they should abolish the all the rotten boroughs and make the parliamentary seats have something to do with the number of people in the populations of the various areas. That Parliament should sit only for 1 year. That politicians in Parliament should not be allowed to sit for 2 parliaments in a row, so there'll be a term limit. And they put in, and they also propose a number of limitations on the power of the Parliament, such as that there should be freedom of religion, that there should be no conscription, that they should abolish all forms of taxation apart from a property tax. And at the time of the war going on, most of the money is coming from an excise, which is a tax on usual commodities, so it falls much more on the poor people, and various other limitations on that power. So you can sort of draw comparisons between that agreement of the people and later the American Constitution as well, which equally has a section which talks about what the powers of the government are and then puts in place a Bill of Rights. And so that's really what the Levelers wish to achieve. Now, at the time when they're most powerful within the army, the leaders of the army are don't really agree with them, but they're put in a position where they have to choose between whether they're going to go with the army, whether they're going to stay loyal to Parliament, and they decide they're going to jump with the army. And the intention being, it seems, that they will go along with the army, with the radical proposals of the army, until they can get it under control and reinforce military discipline. And just at the point when the army is going to call another general rendezvous and to agree the agreement of the people and force that through for settlement on the nation, then the king escapes from Hampton Court, and in the chaos that ensues, the leaders of the army manage to reinforce military discipline and sort of push the radicals aside. So this is in late 1647. Now, with this sort of reaction, this reaction amongst the military leaders does sort of force a split between the radical forces in the army and the military leaders. But then, within about 3 months, a war breaks out again. The civil war starts again, and the leaders of the army find themselves surrounded by enemies, including the Cavaliers on one side, and also their old allies within the Parliament, who were known as the Presbyterians. So, surrounded by enemies, they then make friends again with the more radical elements. And for a long time, up until the period when the king is actually executed, there's attempt to sort of keep the more radical elements on side. Now, from the point of view of people like John Lilburn, they're just stringing them along until such a time as Oliver Cromwell and the other army leaders can have their wicked way. And so, when it comes to the plan of the execution of the king and the move to a republic, John Lilburn especially, he's not in favour of any of those things, because there isn't a precedent in law for what they're doing. They're setting up an extraordinary court in order to try the king. And also, if the king is removed and the enemies within Parliament are removed, then there's nothing to stop some kind of military dictatorship forming, which is exactly what actually happens with the Republic. So that's a little bit of the history of it. And I know I've whipped through it all. But
Introduction, Richard.
I do want to mention a little bit about how the Levelers have been viewed in history. And you'd think, in terms of what they were proposing, things like the abolition of rotten boroughs, the extension of the franchise, free trade, freedom of religion, you'd think that when it came to the liberal period in the 19th century, given the similarity of the programs, that the liberals of that period would sort of hold these people up as heroes. But if you actually read the sort of histories that were being written by liberals in that time, you find something quite different. If you take, for instance, John Morley, a very prominent liberal in the 19th century, he says this. He says the cry of the political leveller was led by Lilburn, one of the men whom all revolutions are apt to engender, intractable, narrow, dogmatic, pragmatic, clever hands at syllogism, liberal in uncharitable imputation, and malicious construction, honest in their rather questionable way, animated by a Pharisaic love of self-applause, in a word, not without sharp insight into theoretical principle, and thinking quite as little of their own ease as of the ease of others, but without a trace of the instinct for government or a grain of practical common sense. Such was Lilburne the headstrong, and such the tempter in thousands of others, with whom Cromwell had painfully to wrestle for all the remainder of his life. Now, that's just one example, and I could find another one in here. But it seems the liberals of the 19th century had no time for these people. They were, and my view of why that would be is firstly, they're too busy writing hagiographies of Oliver Cromwell. And the Levellers don't really fit into their sort of liberal conception of history, or their Whig theory of history, where everything's always getting better. And so if you are too soon, it's just as bad as being too late. So if in the 19th century you were opposed to the end of slavery, then you'd be wrong. But if you were calling for the end of slavery at some time when it wasn't right, then you would also be wrong. And so the Levellers are attacked really for not being able to read the future and think that, well, Cromwell and his gang was as good as it could be, and that they should have just shut up and just done what they were told at that point. And so it's not until really the 20th century, with some of the more socialist historians, that anybody really appreciates the contribution that the Levellers made. And so it's customary when a libertarian speaks on the Levellers that they have a go at the left and say, hands off these people, they're actually good libertarians, and you've sort of stolen them from us. But in reality, they didn't steal them from anybody. They just sort of found them in the gutter of history, and they sort of, I was saying to Brian, they sort of homesteaded them. And you can make a case if you read what the Levellers were saying, because they're writing in a very sort of an ever-changing political situation. You don't find a very dry political treatise of what they're standing for. There's a lot of repetition in what they're saying, because they're trying to write in a more journalistic fashion. So you can find things to support the idea that they were, shall we say, sort of left wing. There are certain ideas that they do put forward. So I wouldn't criticise the left for that reason. But in final, as I get in the signal from Simon, one of the main criticisms of the Levellers has always been that they were not realistic in what they wanted to do. That they wanted to bring some form of democracy, although democracy as we would call it, they wouldn't call it. They believed in consent, that the power comes from the individual, and that individuals should consent to whatever government they are under. But they certainly would have enlarged the franchise. And the argument is that they were not realistic in what they tried to achieve. But then you have to consider what the alternative was. And the alternative that we were faced with was a very narrowly drawn republic, which was really just an oligarchy that was supported which could stay in place just as long as they had the military on their side. And as soon as Oliver Cromwell changed his mind, then that republic disappeared and fell to pieces with hardly anybody mourning its loss. And then if you look at Cromwell, who the liberals of the 19th century put a statue in front of Houses of Parliament, what happened with him? What was realistic about his rule? As soon as he died, his whole system of government fell into pieces as well. And so what the Levellers were actually trying to do was to put in place a broadly supported political settlement, which would at least have meant that the people were generally had something to defend in some kind of republic. So in the final point I'd make then is the final point I make is when you consider the Levellers and their place in, shall we say, the grand scheme, the sort of like the liberal tradition, they're accused of being sort of unrealistic, accused of being too extreme, and they're accused that if what they wanted had been achieved, then it had led to chaos and the whole breakdown of society. Now, to my mind, it's not that different what people say about libertarians to this day. They make the same sorts of accusations against us. And so, isn't that what they say? Even libertarians that want to involve themselves in say a political party, you know, keep your opinions to yourself, you know, and take whatever theme rule we hand out. So that's why I say that these people should be seen as libertarian heroes, and the fact that they've been scorned for so long should give us ourselves courage that, you know, when we are scorned, that we're putting ourselves in a great tradition. On that, I'll say any questions.